In video 2 for Unit 9, we're going to continue to look at the ongoing Cold War throughout the late 50s, 1960s, and early 1970s. In 1956, there was a revolution in the country of Cuba, just 90 miles south of Florida. Up until 1956, the United States and Cuba had a pretty good relationship. The leader in Cuba had been friendly with the United States. We helped them get their independence, remember, back in the Spanish American War in the late 1890s. However, when Fidel Castro led this revolution in Cuba, he started implementing policies that were more along the lines of communism and also seemed to be making overtures towards the Soviet Union as far as becoming allies with them. Well, obviously, with containment, this was a problem. The United States doesn't want to see communism spread, especially to a nation so close to the United States. So the United States CIA and government came up with a plan to take some of the men who had fled Cuba, who had fought against Castro and fled when he took control. A lot of them had fled into southern Florida. The idea is to take some of these men, train them with military training, and then send them back into Cuba to help start an uprising against Fidel Castro to remove him from power. Now, if this doesn't sound like a very good plan, that's because it really wasn't. But the United States decided to go forward with it, and not surprisingly, this small force was captured very quickly by Castro's forces. It then became a huge embarrassment to the United States when it was discovered by the world that we were behind this. Now, the goal of the Bay of Pigs invasion was to remove Fidel Castro from power and get rid of the communist threat. This invasion does just the opposite. The group is captured quickly. Instead of getting rid of Fidel Castro, it makes him look even stronger in the eyes of the Cubans, so it firmly establishes him as the leader of Cuba. And it also forces him to become even more friendly with the Soviet Union. So, on all accounts, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a huge disaster. How did the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro's policies lead to fears in the United States? What was the goal of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and did it work? Now, soon after this, it was discovered that the Soviet Union was putting missiles into Cuba. Now, these missiles would put most major American cities within range, which was obviously a huge concern for the United States. These also could be nuclear weapons that could be used. So, a period of history known as the Cuban Missile Crisis began. President Kennedy, who was also president during the Bay of Pigs invasion, had to make a decision about what to do. Some people thought he should invade Cuba. Other people thought he should take a more cautious approach. He decided to kind of go in the middle, not to invade Cuba, but to create what he called a quarantine around Cuba, where we would send ships to keep other Soviet ships from coming into Cuba to bring more missile material into Cuba. Now, he didn't call it a blockade because a blockade is actually an act of war. But this was, for all intents and purposes, a blockade, and Cuba and the Soviet Union could have claimed this, and we could have gone to war here. So the whole world is watching this to see, are we about to go to World War III and nuclear war here? Fortunately, the two sides came up with a deal where we agreed to take some missiles out of Turkey and some other areas of Europe. In exchange for that, the Soviet Union agreed that they would take the missiles out of Cuba, and this ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I want you to look at this cartoon for just a second because we're going to ask you a question about it in just a moment. Now, to help you interpret this, the two men on top were the leaders of the Soviet Union and the United States. This is Kennedy on the left and Khrushchev on the right, who was the leader of the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, what caused the Cuban Missile Crisis? And according to the political cartoon, what did the Cuban Missile Crisis make both the United States and the Soviet Union realize about the escalating Cold War? So as we look at this cartoon, we see this monster coming out of the box, and the box is called nuclear war. And the two leaders are looking at each other saying, let's get a lock for this thing. So, if anything good came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the fact that the two nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, realized that they had almost taken the world to the brink of nuclear war, and that they needed to do a better job in the future of handling situations so that these crises didn't come to this point where we almost go to war again. So in this cartoon, we see the two nations realizing, hey, we've got to get this under control. We've got to do a better job of the way we're dealing with each other, or the results could be disastrous. We also got involved in the Vietnam War. Now, this is a war we could spend a lot of time talking about. We don't have the time to do that, unfortunately, in a class like this. But we slowly got involved in Vietnam over a period of years to kind of help South Vietnam out because the situation in Vietnam was very similar to what happened in Korea. North Vietnam was communist. The country had been split. South Vietnam was an area that we supported, kind of like what happened with North and South Korea during the Korean War. So we get involved in South Vietnam at first just to kind of help them more like an advisor role as they tried to resist the North Vietnamese taking them over. But as time goes on, we get heavily involved into a full scale war in Vietnam. So the reason we got involved in Vietnam was containment. We are wanting to keep communism from spreading, but there's also this theory called the domino theory. And if you look at this picture here, the fear was if one country fell to communism in a region, then all the other countries would fall as well, like a domino being knocked over and knocking over all the other dominoes. So one of the reasons the United States felt we needed to get involved in South Vietnam was because of this idea called the domino theory. The moment where the United States really increased our role in Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Basically, what happened is some North Vietnamese ships supposedly fired upon American Navy ships in this area called the Gulf of Tonkin. And this led to President Johnson going to Congress and asking for more ability to send more troops to protect our interest in Vietnam. And what Congress passed was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. But what this basically did was give President Johnson the authority to do pretty much anything he wanted in Vietnam. And because of this, our troop numbers went from just a few hundred in 1964 when the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was first passed to over 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam by 1968. If you look at this cartoon on the right, we have Johnson filling out a blank check. So basically, what Congress did was give Johnson a blank check to do whatever he wanted to in Vietnam, and this allowed the president to greatly increase our role. How did the domino theory and the containment policy contribute to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War? And what impact did the Gulf of Tonkin resolution have on U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War? Now, something that also had a huge impact on the Vietnam War was television. If you look at this chart here, you'll notice in 1950, very few Americans had television. But by the time we get to 1965 and 70, when we had huge numbers of troops in Vietnam, we've got over 90% and almost over 95% in 1970 of American households with a television. Well, this was a radical change in how people were able to receive news. The Vietnam War is sometimes called the living room war because for the first time ever, people could actually see news coverage of a war while sitting in their homes. Beforehand, to see any kind of news video about anything, you'd had to go to the movies and watch a little news clip before your movie started. But now people could see this in their homes. And what they were seeing shocked them. You know, war is a horrible thing. And for people back home, they'd never been exposed to it before. But now they're seeing these horrible images from Vietnam. And even if this was a war that turned out to be a very successful war for us, the fact that Americans are seeing these kind of things for the first time, it would have been hard. But the fact that Vietnam becomes a difficult war for us, these images on the television just makes it harder and harder for the government and for the military to continue to keep support for the war. Television also impacted politics. In 1960, for the first time ever, we had a presidential debate live on television. People could sit in their homes and watch the people running for president, the two guys running for president, debate. This was the Kennedy Nixon debate. Now, Nixon was more knowledgeable. He had a lot more experience than Kennedy, and people that listened to this on the radio thought that maybe Nixon did a better job. But on the television screen, Kennedy came across a whole lot more confident. He just looked a lot better on the television screen than Nixon did. And people that watched this on television came across with the idea, or Kennedy came across to them as being somebody very confident, where Nixon didn't really look that way. Now, it's hard to know exactly the impact that this debate had on the election, but it was a close election and Kennedy won. And a lot of people think maybe he doesn't win that election without television. This was a game changer in politics. It made people realize that the image of people on video, on screen, was now super important, and it was something that all political candidates in the future had to make sure that they did a good job with, making sure they came across on television or on video very confident. Why was the Vietnam War called the Living Room War? How did this impact the perception of the Vietnam War in America? And which two presidential candidates' televised debate changed politics?